Okay, so now we're going to pick up with the second part of today's lecture. The second part of today's lecture is going to deal with the Heilbronner article, okay? Heilbronner article entitled Economic Systems. And then we're going to move on to chapters 5 and 6. The macroeconomic approach, and then how we measure national output and income, okay? So let's start with Heilbronner, okay? There's something that I'd just like to add to the Heilbronner article before we actually go over it. In economics, right, we left off with the history of thought tree, and with the history of thought tree we saw that there were two different ways of envisioning capitalism, which is the political economic system that is of the most relevance to us because it is the one in which the vast majority of the globe lives, okay? And has for at least the last few hundred years, okay? The same way there was a left and a right side within the history of economic thought tree, there is also two different ways economics itself is defined by the left and the right side, okay? The right side of the history of economic thought tree, basically everyone to the right of Keynes, right? Remember we drew that imaginary line down the sheet, okay, where Keynes is on the left and the neoclassicals and textbook Keynesians are on the right, okay? They see economics, which I've labeled here as the neoclassical definition, because I would make the argument that textbook Keynesians are really just neoclassicals, which we'll see at the end of week 5, hopefully. But that the neoclassical definition of economics is the allocation of scarce resources amongst competing ends. Okay, so it's the allocation, how things get divided up, of scarce resources. So resources are scarce. We are just assuming resources are scarce. Okay? The division, or how it's divided up, the distribution of scarce resources amongst competing ends. We're all competing for these resources, and they're scarce, and how they get divided up, how they are distributed, the allocation of these scarce resources amongst these competing ends is what the neoclassicals call economics. Okay? On the other hand, there's a heterodox definition. Heterodox economics would apply to the left side of the history of thought tree. Okay? And the left side of the history of thought tree says that economics is simply the social provisioning process. Okay? The social provisioning process. And you could also say it's known as the solution to the economic problem. Okay. That raises another question. What is the economic problem? Well, in the heterodox view, the economic problem, what that is simply three questions. What are we going to produce? Who is going to produce it? And how is it going to be distributed? That is, who's going to get it. Okay? So what are we going to produce? Who's going to produce it? And how is it going to be distributed? Okay? If you keep in mind those three questions, as we go through the Heilbronner article, you're going to see different economic systems, whether it's a traditional society, a command society, or a market society. Each one of those answers those three questions differently, and I'll point that out as I go. Okay? I obviously agree with the second definition. Many people have made the point that the allocation of scarce resources amongst competing ends is only relevant to capitalism, or a market economy. Okay, why is that? Well, in a traditional society, that is, an example would be a hunter-gatherer society, like humans 10,000 years ago, one would make the case that resources weren't scarce, right? If they wanted more corn, for lack of a better example, they would simply go produce more corn and then they would share it with one another, which means that it wasn't a scarce resource. They could get more if they wanted to, so therefore it could be abundant. Okay? Anyway, your textbook would say that economics is the allocation of scarce resources amongst competing ends. The heterodox definition sees economics as the social provisioning process, okay? Social, meaning we're all interrelated somehow in this process, right? The social provisioning process. Provisioning simply who's getting what and how do we reproduce this society. So we all depend upon each other to reproduce this society, okay? Social provisioning process, and it answers the economic problem of what to produce, who's going to produce it, and who's going to get it, and why. Okay? So let's keep that in mind as we go through the Heilbronner article. Okay? So Robert Heilbronner. Heilbronner is probably most famous for writing this book entitled The Worldly Philosophers. Okay? The Worldly Philosophers was a book he decided to write. It's about the history of economic thought. It deals a lot with the tree that we did in the first lecture. Okay? And the history of economic thought book he wrote, called The Worldly Philosophers, looks at most of the names on that tree, and he wrote a nice little chapter on each of them. Okay? He's most famous for that, but he was a worldly scholar himself, okay, who wrote hundreds of articles and plenty of books, and this is one such article he wrote for the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay? Back before everyone went to Wikipedia, Encyclopedia Britannica would probably be the most famous, well-known, most important collection of knowledge, best encyclopedia. Okay? So Heilbronner, economic systems are the different ways in which humankind, okay, have arranged for its material provisioning. Okay, so there's different ways we as a society, as humans, can structure ourselves in order to provide for our material provisioning. That is our food, clothing, shelter, and our other wants, right? Food, clothing, and shelter are our basic needs, and our other wants would be ice cream, right? Or a car, right? Things you don't need in order to survive, but things we've developed a taste for. Okay? History has seen three types of such economic systems. Okay? So an economic system is how society arranges itself in order to reproduce itself. That's what an economic system is. Fundamentally, that's what we're studying in this course. How do we, as a society, reproduce ourselves and meet our demands, our wants, our material provisioning? Okay? Throughout all of human history, at least that which we are aware of, there's been three types of economic systems. The first one we would call a traditional society. Okay? And I'm going to go through these more in a couple minutes. The first one is a traditional society. The second one is a command society. And the third one, which is sort of unique from the first two, is a market society. Okay? And I will discuss where capitalism fits in with a market society when we get to it. Okay? Let's go down to a traditional society. Okay? The economic problem, which I mentioned before, it's what are we going to produce, how are we going to produce it, and who's going to get it? That question, that problem, essentially involves two different aspects of a provisioning process. Okay? It is related to production and distribution. Right? It's what are we going to produce? So that's production. Who's going to produce it? That's production. Who's going to get it? It by the stuff that's produced. Well, that's a question of distribution. Who's going to get what and why? Okay? And that's what this number 5 mentions right here. Number 5 says the economic problem of production and distribution is summarized by 3 questions. What goods and services are going to be produced? Okay? Are we going to produce lawyers or are we going to produce garbage men? How are they going to produce? How are we going to produce lawyers or bottles of water, right? Are we going to make them out of plastic, or are we going to make it out of a canteen, right? Or is it going to be steel? And for whom are we going to produce them, right? Are we going to produce bottles of water for us, or are we going to produce bottles of water for only females, right? Who is going to get it? Who's going to get the output, okay? The first type of economic system, let me lower that for you. A traditional society, a tradition-based society, depends largely on communal expressions of approval or disapproval. Okay? An easy example of a traditional society would be the Native Americans. Okay? Another one would be the household. Right? Say you sit down for a family dinner. That's a traditional economy. Let's take the latter example, the family dinner. Right? Let's say it's a holiday, Easter. Okay? It depends largely on communal expressions of approval or disapproval. Okay? At Easter dinner, right? Who sits at the head of the table? Usually the father, the man of the house, whoever. Why? Why does that matter? Well, it's just what the communal expression, it's what the community feels. It's his house, it's his table, his meal, whatever. So therefore, he gets to sit at the head. Or on Thanksgiving, when somebody carves up a turkey, right? Who carves it up? It's usually the man of the house. Why isn't it the second cousin who sits in the middle of the table? It's just the way it works, okay? The same way with Native Americans, how the chief always got the best cut of meat. It was usually the heart from a buffalo or a bison, right? Why? Because that was thought to be the most valuable piece of the hunt, right, of the kill. So why did they get that? It's because they were the chief. It's the way it worked, okay? There was sharing involved. Command systems, okay, the second type of economic system, a command system utilizes the open use of power, okay? It uses physical coercion, okay? There's physical coercion and the possibility of punishment. A command economy could be the USSR, from back when it was the USSR, not Russia as it is now, North Korea, or feudalism, right? Feudalism is the economic system of medieval Europe, right? The 13th century, let's say, where you have a king, and underneath him is some nobles, and underneath the nobles are the serfs, right? What gave that economy power? It was the king, who was believed to be the king because that's the way God wanted it, right? It was called divine intervention, divine rule. God made him the king, so therefore, you'd better listen to him, okay? So that was open coercion. If the king said, hey, give me half of your land, you gave him half of your land, or else you might have your head chopped off, right? So that's a command economy, okay? In a traditional economy, traditional society, things are done because that's the way everyone agrees it should be done, okay? Everyone works together in a community. Which incidentally, a traditional society is the form of economy that humans have lived the longest under. We were in traditional society from the beginning of our existence up until at least the time of the Egyptians. I'm not sure how long that was, but it was many thousands of years. Probably hundreds of thousands of years. Right? Then, starting with the Egyptians, you could make the case it was a command economy, right? You had a pharaoh, and the pharaoh told you what to do. Hey, build me a pyramid. Hey, run a canal from the Nile to this town. Okay? That was based on his power, whether it was the pharaoh or the king or the USSR or North Korea now. Okay? The third type of economy is the market economy. Okay? And that also, the market economy also has pressures and incentives, but the interesting thing about a market economy is that no one individual or no one group typically control any other person or group. Okay? In other words, in a traditional society, the group, right, if you're at your dinner table, or if it was Native Americans, it would be the Council of Warriors, controlled what everyone else did and thought, right? Maybe your grandfather controls Easter dinner, right? How things are going to be set up, what you're going to eat. In a command economy, the king or the ruler of North Korea, right, a dictator of North Korea, decides this is how it's going to be, okay? In a market economy, there are still individuals and still groups. The same way there's a ruler of North Korea and there's still a group of warriors. Yet, a fundamental difference is those individuals don't have the level of power that they did in a traditional or a command society. Okay? So that's the thing. That's one thing that's unique about a market economy. Okay? That being that no one truly has extreme authority over any other group or individual. Okay? So here we come to capitalism now. Okay? Capitalism is a form of a market economy. Okay? They're not one and the same. Capitalism is not a market economy. A market economy is not capitalism. Okay? Capitalism is a form of a market economy. Okay? Markets existed in Roman antiquity, right? Back in the, let's say, 200 AD, right? There were markets there, but that wasn't capitalism. Okay? There were markets in medieval Europe. Remember Marco Polo? They were selling spices all across the spice trail, right? Went from the Middle East to China. Those were markets. Those weren't capitalist markets. Okay? Capitalism is the only social order so far. Capitalism is the only social order in which the market plays a dominant role. Okay? I'm going to get to what I mean by capitalism in a minute, but it's the only time humans under capitalism, it's the only time that the market has been elevated to a dominant position. Okay? With Marco Polo and the spice trade, there were markets, right? But those markets existed within a command economy, right? If the king said, hey Marco Polo, knock off this spice route you're running between here and China, it would have been done, okay? Today, if you tried to eliminate a market in Coca-Cola, good luck, right? The soda market is what runs the economy. It's not one group saying, hey, stop selling Coca-Cola. Okay? This is an important concept to grasp. In capitalism, the market has become what we could call, it has become disembedded from society. Okay? What do I mean by that? Previously, whether it was a traditional society or a command society, the market or the economy was embedded in social relations, right? If you want more ham at your Easter dinner, then you ask your aunt for it, right? And you get more ham and whatnot. Or if the king wanted more corn to be grown, then he said grow more corn, and more corn was grown. Okay? So those social relations, whether it's a social relationship, you asking your aunt for ham, or whether it's a political relationship with the king telling you to grow more corn, the economy, right? What are we producing? How are we producing it? And who's getting it? Those three economic questions were answered by social or political relationships. Okay? So whether it was command or traditional, the economy was embedded within the social or political relations. Okay? In a market economy, specifically capitalism, it's the first time in human history that the economy has become disembedded. Okay? If you want to produce more stuff, right? If we want more water, we don't listen to the king telling you to produce more water. You don't ask your aunt for more water, right? If we want more water, how do we know that we need to make more water? The market tells us, right? Prices go up. Since prices have gone up, someone says, hey, price of water went up, maybe I should start making some more water. Okay? So the economy has become disembedded. Incidentally, when capitalism rose to prominence, that's the first time the topic of economics was discovered. Right? Adam Smith, 1776. It's no coincidence that you start seeing all these people writing about economics once the economy became disembedded from social and political relationships. Okay? That was because we could finally point to it, right? Today, if you walk down the street, you see some homeless people or you see unemployed people, right? You can say, oh wow, they are unemployed because the economy is bad, right? Well, in previous times, say feudal times, you would say to yourself, what are those people doing there? I guess the king told them to be sitting there, okay? So, or I guess the king told them, go home, you no longer have a job, right? So the economy was embedded in feudal times, right? It was embedded in the political and social relationships. Today, right, it's disembedded. You can actually point and say, hey, the economy is doing really well, or hey, the economy is doing really poorly. Okay? The economy is no longer tied to social or political relationships. It has a logic of its own. Okay? Even though you cannot really see the economy, right? It's sort of an abstract concept. If you go to, even though you can't see the economy, if you go to any corner store, any 7-Eleven, and you see people buying and selling things, you are looking at the economy. Okay? When somebody hands over money for a Slurpee, that's the economy in motion. The difference is that's not happening because a king said to do it, because your aunt wanted you to do it, right? That would be a command or a traditional economy. Right now, things are being bought and sold because of the market. Okay? So the economy becomes disembedded from social and political relationships. Now, if you just follow my lecture notes down, right? I talk about traditional societies a little bit, and then I talk about command societies for a little bit. Okay? But then we come to a market economy. Okay? There are certain preconditions you need for a market economy to exist. Okay? In order to have a market economy, the first precondition is that you need to shake up the social order. Okay? Put yourself in 13th century England. Okay? You have bunch of serfs and a king. The king is the ruler because that's what God wanted, right? It was divine rule. Okay, well now, in about the 1600s, that order is breaking apart. No longer did people think the king was the king because that's the way God wanted it. Okay, you had the Renaissance, you had the English Civil War, the feudal order was breaking apart. Okay, what ended up happening is, in order for this market system to work, people have to believe that they are fending for each other now, or for themselves, excuse me, fending for themselves. Okay. In feudal times, there was something called noblesse oblige, okay, which isn't really particularly important for this course, but noblesse oblige was a system in which, since God made you a noble or a king, right, you had to take care of those underneath you. Okay, so there was sort of a shared sacrifice, right? The serfs gave most of their crops and stuff to the king or the nobles. But the noble and the king had to watch out for the serfs. They had to take care of them, make sure they didn't die, have a terrible life. Okay? Well, in capitalism, in order to get a market economy working, you need people to believe they have to fend for themselves, right? Everyone's on their own. Okay? If you can't get a job, that's too bad. You're going to starve, right? Something like that. You have to make people think you have to fend on your own. So in feudalism, in a command economy, people didn't think they had to fend for themselves, right? It was more, well, we had a bad harvest, but that's okay. The king will make sure I'm not going to die, right? At least most kings. Whereas in capitalism, if your business fails, there really is no guarantee you're going to make it, right? You could become homeless. Subsequently, we have developed unemployment insurance and things of that nature, right? Food stamps. But before those existed, you were on your own, okay? So in order to make a market economy work, the first thing is you have to get people to believe they're on their own. Second, you have to make people want material gain. Okay? In a command economy or in a traditional society, there was no such thing as material gain. You're born a serf, you're going to die a serf. Okay? If you're not a warrior in a Native American tribe, then you're never going to be a warrior. Okay? You're most likely not going to be a warrior. But in a market economy, people think you can go rags to riches. Okay? You need people to strive for material gain. Okay? Typically, it's not true. The vast majority, I think it's somewhere in the high 90% of millionaires are born millionaires. Okay? It's not to say people can't go rags to riches. It's just that it is highly unlikely that it will happen. The point being, though, if people believe they can go from poverty to massive wealth, and it's every man for themselves, then you get people who will start opening up stores and businesses and things of that nature, which then allows a supply and a demand to form, which is the cornerstone of any market, right? A market depends on two things, supply and demand. Okay? Thus, in order to make a market economy work, in order to make capitalism work, which is a type of a market economy, you need people to think they're on their own, and you need them to think that they can go rags to riches. Okay? That's one of the things that holds America together, right? The vast majority of us are never going to be millionaires, but we all think we're going to be millionaires. There's a famous quote by Thorsten Veblen, I believe, who was on our History of Thought tree, who said, Americans, he was originally Norwegian, born in Norway, and he said Americans or people in poverty in America are all temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Right? We all think we're going to be rich, we can do it, We're just not quite there yet. Okay? That is one of the binding preconditions. You need that condition to exist in order for capitalism to hold together. The third requirement for capitalism, for a market economy, is wage labor. You need people who will work for a wage. Okay? They will sell their labor for a wage. Okay? Without that, you don't have any workers. Okay? So you need people who are willing to sell their labor in exchange for some money. That's how a workforce develops. The fourth thing you need, the next two aren't really that big. The fourth thing you need are property rights. Okay? I mean, they're big, but they're not. They're essential preconditions, but we're not going to be concerned with them so much in this class. The fourth one is property rights. You have to know who owns what, right? This is my store. This is my gasoline. This is my Coca-Cola, right? It's his water factory. The fifth thing you need is the government to be seen as an independent actor. Okay? In a Native American society or in a command society, the government was the economy. The government determined the whole economy, right? That was the point I was making about embeddedness, right? The government was the economy. Government said make more stuff, you made more stuff. Well, now, in capitalism, you need the government to be seen as an independent actor, right? You have this market with supply and demand coming together in the market, and the government can choose to either get involved in the market or not. Okay, so the government's an independent actor. Okay. Finally, I just wanted to point out, I skipped over the stages of capitalism in my lecture notes, just FYI. Finally, all economies are mixed economies. What I mean by mixed is there really is no pure market economy. There is no pure command society. There is no pure traditional society. Okay? If we were having a classroom session right now, you would see, right, if you were in front of me instead of at home or wherever you may be, in the next 15 minutes you would see 3 different types of economies. Okay? And you probably will now in your everyday life. The point being, these are mixed economies. Okay? For example, if you were in class right now, right, if you were at these desks, I'd let you out and you'd leave. And let's say 2 people get to a door at the same time, right? Well, when you hold the door for someone else, you say, hey, you can go first, right? Why did you do that? It's irrational. You got to the door, you should go through it, right? Well, that's a traditional society, right? A traditional economy is you do things because it's the way it's done, right? It's according to communal expressions of approval, right? You don't want to be the jerk who rushes out the door, so you say to someone else, hey, you go first, right? So that would be a traditional society. A command economy would be, you get home and somebody tells you that you have a chore to do, right? You have to do you have to take out the garbage, or you have to do the laundry, or the dishes, whatever, right? That's a command economy. Finally, on your way home from this course, let's say you stopped at 7-Eleven, right? You bought a Slurpee, okay? Well, you bought a Slurpee. You demanded a Slurpee, 7-Eleven supplied it, okay? So that was a market economy. So within 15 minutes, you've encountered all 3 types of economic systems. So all economies are really just mixed economies, right? Within the US right now, the US is predominantly a market economy, but in the household, you encounter a traditional society and At work, you mostly encounter a command economy, right? Command meaning you go to work, the market doesn't tell you what you should do at work. Your boss tells you what to do at work, right? He commands you to do that, okay? Or she. He or she commands you to do that, okay? So finally, what is capitalism? Okay? Capitalism is a market economy. Okay? Capitalism is a type of a market economy with one important addition. Okay? Capitalism is a market economy that also has a developed, complex financial system. Okay? It has a developed financial system. Okay? Where certain prices are determined on financial markets. Okay? So capitalism is a market economy that also has a developed financial system. Okay? So that's what capitalism really is. Capitalism is a market economy that also has brought in finance. Okay? When you put markets and finance and financing together, you get capitalism. Okay? Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. Now that we're done with the introduction, okay? In the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to finish up 50, maybe 60 minutes. We're going to wrap up week 1. Okay? I know this lecture's probably gone a little longer than you were anticipating. The rest of them won't be this long, but we had to fit a lot into this first lecture. Just the way it goes. We had to hit the ground running. Okay? Now we're going to switch gears from the history of economic thought and Heilbronner, and we're going to move into chapters 5 and 6 of Case and Fair. Okay? I'm going to go down the PowerPoints, at least the very important PowerPoints for you. Okay? I'm going to omit some of the PowerPoints. I'm going to leave out some of the slides, things I don't feel are that important. And again, obviously this is true anyway. If you have questions about anything, just email it to me, or come by my office, set up an appointment, something like that. Okay? So, I mentioned at the beginning of class that we're going to be talking about. Drop something. I mentioned at the beginning of class that we're going to be talking about macroeconomics. Okay? Macroeconomics stresses 3 fundamental things. Okay? There's really 3 big variables that we look at in macroeconomics. Okay? Those 3 big variables in macroeconomics are output. Okay? What's output? It's just the amount of stuff the economy makes. Okay? The amount of lawyers, the amount of doctors, the amount of firemen, the amount of water, the amount of backpacks, the amount of Slurpees, okay? The amount of stuff we make, right? If we go back to the economic problem, what are we going to produce, right? That's output. Output is what are we producing? Is it Slurpees or Big Macs? Or both? You probably can't even read that. Hopefully that's a little better, but the computer would not let me go over 100%. Sorry. 3 major concerns of macro. Output. What are we going to produce? Unemployment. Okay? Unemployment, simply what resources do we have, what labor resources do we have that are not being utilized? Okay? Incidentally, this is just very interesting, I find at least, capitalism is the only form of social organization amongst all organisms. Okay? So that's bees, birds, ostriches, what have you. Okay? Capitalism is the only form of organization of any group of organisms, right? And it's the only one in which humans have existed that has unemployment. The word unemployment had no meaning before capitalism developed, right? It was a concept that was invented with capitalism. It's the only time any species has ever left some members of that species without anything to do. Finally, we're going to look at inflation and deflation. Okay? Inflation and deflation refer to prices. Okay? Inflation is when prices go up. Deflation is when prices go down. Okay? So if you think about it, what this is really saying, in macroeconomics, we're going to be looking at what are we producing, who's producing it, and how much does it cost. Okay? It's the stuff we're making, who's making it, and the prices of those things. Are the prices going up? Are the prices going down? These are just some practice questions that come with the PowerPoints. So now we're going to talk about output. Okay? With output, sometimes you hear on the news the business cycle. Okay? Especially if you are a business major or you're in finance, right? You hear about the business cycle. Okay? The business cycle is coming to an end. What does that mean? Well, a business cycle is simply the short-term up and downs in the economy. Okay? It's a business cycle. The economy, capitalism, it moves cyclically. Right? It's sort of like a sine wave. If you guys know mathematics and you've graphed a sine wave, it goes up, it goes down. It goes up, it goes down. Okay? That's the business cycle. A business cycle is it goes up, it goes down, and it returns to the same spot. Okay? That's a business cycle. Aggregate output. Aggregate is a word you should probably get familiar with using. You should get comfortable using it. Aggregate simply means total or sum. Okay? Aggregate output is all of the stuff we make in this country. Okay? Recession. That's a term you're probably familiar with. You hear it in the news a lot. In 2008, we entered into the Great Recession. Okay? A recession is when aggregate output goes down. Okay? It's 2 quarters, 2 business quarters. You have 12 months in a year. If you divide it up into 4 quarters, then each quarter lasts 3 months. Okay? So, if you have 2 quarters, which is 6 months of economic activity that declines, right? So if your aggregate output goes down from January to March, and then again from March to June, if it goes down, then you're in a recession, right? If you're making less stuff in July than you were in January, then you're in a recession, okay? A depression is simply a prolonged and deep recession. So a depression is a really bad recession. I would make the argument now that we are currently in a depression, right? You usually bounce back from recessions. Technically, we have a recovery currently, supposedly going on in this country. However, it's been 2008 when the economy crashed. It's now 2014. It's been 6 years. We still have a fifth of homeowners underwater on their mortgages, right? A fifth of all homeowners are still delinquent on their mortgages. Unemployment is currently 6.5%, but it's only 6.5% because people are leaving the workforce. If we had the same amount of people looking for jobs right now that we did in 2008, the unemployment rate would actually be a lot closer to 12 and 13%. Right? The only reason it's gone down is because the economy is so bad, people have given up hope. Okay? And our politicians call that a victory. But I would make the case we're in a depression. Okay? Whether we are or aren't is a moot point. The economy is currently very bad. Okay? Going back to the business cycle. Okay? When the economy goes up, the economy goes down, up and down. An expansion or a boom, okay, an expansion or a boom is when aggregate output, and another word for aggregate output is GDP, which we can write as realize it may be hard to see that. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, GDP. And we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. We're going to talk about that more. But an expansion is simply when aggregate output, or GDP, is expanding. Okay? The amount of stuff we make is going up. Okay? The size of the pie is getting bigger. So you can call that an expansion or a boom. Okay? A contraction, a recession, or a slump is when the economy is shrinking. The amount of stuff we're making is going down. Aggregate output is dropping. Okay? The pie is getting smaller. If you combine an expansion with a slump, you get a business cycle, right? You're going up, you're going down. It's a business cycle. This is what a typical business cycle looks like, okay? Here we have a trough, right? It's the bottom. Trough is the bottom. Then you have an expansion where aggregate economic output is going up, right? We're making more stuff. Then we reached a peak, okay? At a peak, let's say something bad happens. The stock market crashes. Okay, stock market crashes, you go into a recession, okay? Go into a recession and a slump, okay, where the economy is contracting. So on the way up, the economy is getting bigger, right? The pie is getting bigger. The amount of stuff we make is growing. And then, once the stock market crashed in our example, right, but it could be many things, then aggregate economic output decreases. The pie gets smaller, and we go into a recession. Let's talk about unemployment. The person who invented macroeconomics was named John Maynard Keynes. Keynes from the middle of our history of economic thought tree. He was the inventor of macroeconomics. Before him, everyone was pretty much doing micro. And Keynes, when he invented macroeconomics, he said what really matters for an economy is full employment. Okay? You want to get to full employment. Why do you want full employment? Because that means all of your labor resources are employed. If all of your labor is employed, right, if you're at full employment, all of your labor resources are employed, then you end up having the maximum amount of output possible, right? Currently, I mentioned the unemployment rate in this country is about 6.5%. Okay, if we put all those people back to work, we could have 6.5% more economic output, right? We could have better roads, we could have more pizza, whatever, right? But you'd have 6.5% more economic output, okay? Keynes, like I mentioned, really cared about employment, which is why we care in macroeconomics about the unemployment rate, right? Since you want to get to full employment, since you need everyone to have a job, or else your economy is not running efficiently, then you care about the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is simply what percentage of your labor force is looking for a job but doesn't have one, okay? It's all the people who want to work but they don't have a job. Finally, there's inflation and deflation. Inflation and deflation deal with price levels, as I mentioned. Inflation is when prices go up. There's an increase in the overall price level. I'll explain what I mean by price level in a second. Deflation is when the overall price level goes down. Okay? Hyperinflation is just when there's a very, very rapid increase of prices, right? If prices were to go up 2%, then that would be an inflation. But if prices were to go up 45%, you would call that a hyperinflation, okay? So what do I mean by price level? Price level is simply, think about like a general price level. What do I mean by that? If you think about all the things you purchase throughout the course of a day, or a month, or a year, right? You typically buy bottles of water, gasoline, rent, right? Food, things like that. If you were to average out the prices of all of those things, you could come up with a general price level, right? It's the general cost of everything you buy, right? Well, if that general price level goes up, you have inflation. If that general price level goes way up, you have hyperinflation. And if that general price level goes down a little, then you have deflation, okay? Currently, as we speak right now in 2014, most of the developed economies have a deflation problem. The Eurozone has deflation. America's price level has been fairly constant for the last 6 years. Even though a lot of people were worried that the Obama bank bailouts was going to lead to hyperinflation and things like this, it never materialized. Right? The inflation never happened, and prices have actually been fairly stable. If you take out the cost of food and the cost of oil, prices have gone down just slightly. Okay. So I mentioned that macroeconomics focuses on the big picture, right? We're taking a bird's eye view of the economy. It's the U.S. economy. It is the European economy, right? In order to get a better understanding of the American economy, right, sometimes we divide macroeconomics up into 4 groups. Okay, we divide it up into households, firms, the government, and the rest of the world. Okay? Households consume and they earn wages. Firms earn profits and they invest. The government is responsible for fiscal policy and monetary policy, which we're going to get to a little bit further on in this lecture. And the rest of the world is simply when an American company does business with a Chinese company. So let's talk about the role of the government real briefly. Fiscal policy. Okay, the government is responsible for two policies, fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy, and these are important to remember throughout the course of the semester. I find students have a hard time memorizing which is which, so just memorize it. Fiscal policy involves the government spending and taxing. Okay, so if the government wants to buy a tank, that's fiscal policy. If it taxes you on April 15th, the way you have to pay your taxes every year, that's fiscal policy. If the government decides to purchase health care for a certain group of individuals, that's fiscal policy. If it taxes a business, right, if it's a profits tax, then that's fiscal policy. Monetary policy, let's backtrack real quick. And fiscal policy is set by the United States Department of the Treasury. Okay, the Department of the Treasury is who sets fiscal policy. Monetary policy is set by the United States Federal Reserve, the central bank. Okay? The Federal Reserve sets monetary policy, and monetary policy is the tools by which the Federal Reserve sets the interest rate. Okay? This slide says that they control the quantity of money, but they don't control the quantity of money. They set interest rates. They set interest rates in trying to control the quantity of money. This is an outdated slide. Okay? But the Federal Reserve cannot control the quantity of money. All it can do is set interest rates. So monetary policy is how the Federal Reserve, or the government, sets interest rates. Okay? So again, fiscal policy. It's government spending and taxing. Fiscal policy is when the United States government buys a tank and then taxes people with an income tax every April. Monetary policy is when the Federal Reserve sets interest rates. Okay? Currently, the interest rate is set at 0, just FYI. The overnight interest rate, which is known as the Fed funds rate, is set at 0%. The slides I skipped over, you can look at those on your own time. It's fine. I encourage you to look at them. It's just not essential for the course. So, but go ahead, look at them on your own time, by all means, please. There's a picture of Keynes, right? Your book points out much of the framework of modern macroeconomics comes from John Maynard Keynes. Okay, so now we're on to chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6. And in chapter 6, now we're going to look at national income and accounting. National income accounting. Okay? In this chapter, I'm going to introduce a lot of the really essential core components of macroeconomics, right? In chapter 5, we looked at the 3 concepts: output, employment, and prices, right? We saw that a recession is when output goes down, a boom is when output goes up, inflation is when prices go up, and deflation is when prices go down. And we also saw that the unemployment rate is what really matters a lot in macroeconomics. If you have a low unemployment rate, then you are most likely in a boom or an expansionary period. because the more people go to work, the more stuff your economy is going to make. Okay? On the other hand, if you have a really high unemployment rate, such as Europe right now, right? In Spain, they have unemployment rates of 20–25%. The underemployment rate there is probably about 35–40%. Underemployment is just when you could be more productive, but you're not being, right? You have a PhD, but you're driving a taxi, okay? Consequently, in Spain, what's happened is aggregate output has gone down, okay? Now we're going to switch gears just a little bit, but they're both interrelated. Now we're going to look at how we go about measuring these things. Okay, so in Chapter 5 we introduced the concepts. Chapter 6, now we're going to see how we actually measure it. Okay, so I mentioned aggregate output is GDP. Aggregate output. It can be measured by the concept of gross domestic product. Okay? Gross domestic product. It's the final market value of all goods and services produced within a nation's border within a given time period. Typically, GDP is measured over a year. Okay? But it can be measured over 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, right? But it's usually measured quarterly and annually or yearly. Okay? It's the total market value. So it's all the total market value of all the stuff the nation makes within a year. Okay? So if we made 10 desks at $2 a piece, and we made 5 bottles of water at $1 a piece, then it would be what? We'd have a GDP of $25. Okay, right? Because 10 times 2 plus 5 times 1. Okay, that would be $25. So that would be our GDP. It would be the total market value of everything this economy, this small economy, produces within a nation's borders, within a given time period. GDP, the concept of GDP, only measures final goods and services. Okay? What's a final good and service? It's something produced for final use. It's something sold to a consumer. Okay? It's something sold on an output market. Okay? For example, a final good. A final good would be these sunglasses, or a bottle of water, or a car. Okay? A car is a final good. An intermediate good, on the other hand, an intermediate good, is simply a good that's produced by one firm that will be used down the line. Okay? Let's think about this. Let's say you are a rubber company. Okay? You are a rubber company that makes tires. If you make the tire and you try to sell it as a tire, then that is a final good, right? Because someone will just buy the tire. Okay? On the other hand, if you take the rubber, turn it into a tire, and sell it to Ford, and then Ford sticks it on a car, then that tire was an intermediate good. Okay? You haven't made an actual tire yet, or you haven't made a car yet. The tire was simply the intermediate good. Okay? Ford is what will produce the final good, right? The car, of which the tire is one component. Okay? So that's the difference between final goods and intermediate goods. Okay? Final good is something that ultimately it's going to be used. When you buy it, it's going to be used. An intermediate good is something that's purchased and it's used to make something else. GDP is only concerned with new production. When we're calculating GDP, when we're adding up aggregate output, right? That's what GDP is. GDP is nothing more than aggregate output. Okay? When we're adding up GDP, you only count the stuff that was produced this year or this quarter. Okay? You don't count the stuff, it's 2014 right now. When we're calculating GDP for 2014, we don't count up the cars that were made in 2012. Can you guess why? Right. It's because the cars that were made in 2012 were counted in GDP for 2012. Right? The cars produced in 2012 were made in 2012. It makes no sense to count them in 2014 as well. If you did that, you would be double counting, and overstating GDP. Right? You made the car in 2012. You didn't make it in 2014. Okay? This is sort of echoing what I just said. There's two ways to calculate GDP, or aggregate output. Okay? There's what we call the expenditure approach, and there's the income approach. Okay? For the expenditure approach, you simply count up how much money was spent that year. For the income approach, you simply count up how much income was received that year. Okay? Now I'm going to turn off the overhead for a second just so I can write a few things on the board. The expenditure approach is this equation, which we're going to see later, but I just want to write it on the board for you now. Okay. Y, or income. Income, GDP, income is equal to, that's what Y stands for. It stands for GDP. Y is equal to consumption, that's a C, consumption plus investment plus government spending, that's what G stands for, government spending, plus NX, okay, NX. Net exports, that's what NX stands for, net exports. Okay, net exports. Net exports is simply exports minus imports. Okay, an export is the things that American companies sell to the rest of the world. Okay? When Coca-Cola sells some cans of Coke to Colombia, that's an export. Okay? When a Chinese company sells something to Walmart, that is an import. Okay? That would be an import. So this is us selling things to the rest of the world. Imports is the rest of the world selling things to us. Okay? The expenditure approach to GDP is Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay? Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Okay? That's the expenditure approach. The second approach, the income approach, is this. Okay. The income approach is simply income, same Y, okay? Income, GDP. Income and GDP are one and the same thing, okay? Why is income and GDP one and the same thing? Well, if whatever you produce within a nation, right, somebody has to be getting paid for it, right? Slavery is illegal, so producing something, if someone produces something, they have to be paid for it. So therefore, since GDP measures production, if people are producing things, they must be getting paid for it. So GDP is always equal to income. Okay? So we have the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach to GDP is simply the total amount of spending, which is also equal to income. Right? Think about it. Every time you buy something, every time you spend money, you're handing money over to someone else. Your spending is their income. Okay? So, if you wanted to calculate GDP and income, which is the same thing, you can either count up the amount of spending that someone does, right? Since your spending is always someone else's income, or you can just count up the total income in the economy. Okay? Total income in the economy, Y, income, GDP, is equal to W, which stands for wages, plus rent, right? Rent, just what you pay every month. I, which stands for interest, okay? Some of you have student debt, you have to pay interest on that. Some of you have mortgages, you have to pay interest on that, okay? Interest plus pi, which is profit. Okay, I mentioned before, economists decided to use pi as profit. So, income, right, there's only really 4 groups of income in this economy. There's wages, there's rents, there's interest, and there's profits. Okay? So that's another way of adding up GDP. Okay? Regardless, remember, Y is equal to this. That's the income approach. The expenditure approach is right? C plus I plus G plus net X. Okay? Since these Y's are the same thing, these are equal. It's two sides of the same coin. You're counting the same thing, but you're measuring it in 2 different ways. Okay? It's almost as if you wanted to count up to 10, right? And in one example, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 10, and then the other way, you go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, right? It's the same way of measuring something. You're just doing it slightly differently. But you're going to get the same answer. So, as I mentioned, whoops, sorry, forgot the computer's up. Okay, so now we're going to work with the expenditure approach. Okay? We're going to work with this bottom one for right now. The expenditure approach, there's 4 categories, right? There's consumption, there's investment, government spending, and net exports. Okay? Consumption, okay, this is very important. Consumption is when households buy consumer goods. Okay? It's simply when households buy things. Garbage bags, steak, water, sunglasses, whatever. Okay? That's what consumption is. Investment is when businesses buy new equipment and capital. Okay? Capital here is not meant to imply money. A lot of people in finance and business think that capital is money. Capital is not money. That's called financial capital. Economic capital are machines. It's the things you use to produce output. That's what capital is. Okay? Because that's what gives you power ultimately. What gives you power is the ability to control if something does or does not get produced. Okay? That's capital. That's investment. Investment adds capital. Okay? Government consumption and investment, simply the government buying tanks and building roads. Okay? Net exports. Net exports is exports minus imports. It's spending by the rest of the world. Right? That's an export. If the rest of the world buys American stuff, we send it to them. That's an export. An import is when the US decides to buy stuff from the rest of the world. They sell us the stuff they made, then that's an import. Okay? The expenditure approach is simply C plus I plus G plus net X. Okay? That's the expenditure approach. Oop, it's right down there. Right? Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports is GDP. This is a chart showing you the US economy in 2007. Okay? The percentage of GDP. Consumption is about 70% of total spending, total GDP. Consumption is about 70%. That's good because consumption is pretty stable, right? Never gets too high, never gets too low. You're going to buy the same amount of hot dogs and hamburgers, same amount of water, all the time, okay? Investment, in 2007, investment was 15% of the US economy, okay? Investment, as we're going to see, at least Keynes argued, investment is volatile, okay? Investment can go way up or way down very quickly. That's what we saw in 2007 and 2008, okay? If people don't think they're going to make money on their investments, then they don't invest. If they don't invest, right, if we're not building factories, right, if we're not building plants to make stuff, then we don't need any workers to make anything. So if people don't invest, unemployment usually goes up. Always goes up. Government spending. Government spending was about 20% in 2007. Okay, it's 20% of the economy. And net exports was 5% negative. Okay? It was negative 5% net exports. What does that mean? It means that currently the United States imports more than it exports. Okay? We buy more stuff from the rest of the world than we sell to the rest of the world. Okay? I'm sure you've heard of this before. It's China, right? It's the trade deficit with China. China exports a lot of stuff to America, but we don't send a whole heck of a lot there. Okay? So, but that's not just for China, it's also with Japan and with Canada and the EU, okay? We buy a lot of stuff from the rest of the world, but we don't sell all that much to the rest of the world. So, that was -5% for the US, okay? So if you add this all up, right? If you add up 70%, which was consumption, 15%, which was investment, 20%, which was the government, and -5%, which was our net exports, which is a leakage. If you think about it, it's a leakage because we're sending money abroad without getting it back. So that's a leakage. It all adds up to 100%. So these are just the components of GDP. Okay. Now we're going to go to the income approach. The income approach, which was the top one, right? Wages, rents, interest, and profit. If you look here, right, the income approach, this is slide 31. Okay? The income approach, compensation of employees, right? That's wages. Employees do a lot of work, right? They show up, they do their work. You have to pay them. That's wages. Okay? Income, for a proprietor, you just think of that as rent, okay, or a profit. Rental income, okay? Rent, it's the thing you pay every month. Corporate profit, which is simply the income of corporations, okay? It's profit. And interest, the interest paid by business, right? If you're a banker, you typically earn interest, right? You make a loan to someone, say you loan someone $100. Okay, I want that $100 back at 5% interest, okay? So what you end up getting, if you loan someone $100, you actually get $105 back, okay? Just because you happen to have money on hand. So that's interest. If you add up interest, profit, rent, and wages, you get GDP. Okay. Now, without getting too crazy about it, without really getting in depth on this topic, there's two different measures of GDP. Okay? Obviously, there's the expenditure and the income approach, but that's two ways of measuring the same number. Okay? We also need to talk about the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Okay? Nominal GDP, this is slide 42. Nominal GDP is simply the current dollar amount of GDP. Okay? Okay? Now GDP, right? There's the expenditure approach and there's the income approach to calculating GDP. Okay? But what we're fundamentally looking at here, right? Why? We're looking at price times quantity. Okay? It's the amount of stuff we made, the quantity of it, times the price level, okay? So what are the prices? If you multiply the amount of stuff you made times its price, you're going to end up with GDP, or income, okay? Now, nominal GDP, nominal, simply means dollar value, okay? Nominal refers to simply price times quantity, okay? But let's say we want to know whether or not this country is doing better than last year, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, okay? If we look at nominal GDP might have gone up from $5 million to $10 million, okay? But here's the question we have to ask ourselves. Are we making more stuff, or did the price level just simply go up? Okay? In other words, let's say $5 million. That was GDP. Let's just suppose fictitiously GDP was $5 million in 1990. Well, okay, we made 5 million bottles of water at $1 a piece. So GDP was $5 million. On the other hand, let's say in 2010, GDP was $10 million. Okay? Well, did we actually make twice as much as we did in 1990? Or did water bottles simply go from being $1 to $2? Right? In 1990, it was 5 million water bottles times $1. Now, we could say that it was $5 million, or 5 million water bottles times $2. So, when we're looking at nominal versus real GDP, what we're really looking at is, did we produce more stuff, or did the price of it just go up? And that's why economists like to look at something called real GDP. We don't look at nominal GDP, we look at real GDP. Real GDP, what it does is, it takes the price level and it holds it constant. I don't know if you remember this from mathematics, but when you have this straight line over something, it means it's constant. Okay? So what we do when we're comparing, say, 1990 and 2010, what you do is you take the quantity from 1990, which was $5 million water bottles, and we multiply it by a price level of $1. Okay? So that gives us $5 million for GDP. Well then, what we do to calculate 2010 GDP is we say, you know what, the price level is still going to be $1. Okay? The price level will be $1. And then we see how many water bottles we made in 2010. Let's just suppose we ended up making 10 million water bottles. Well, okay, 10 million times 1 is $10 million. So it turns out GDP actually doubled, right? We're producing twice as much stuff as we did in 1990. Okay? That's the difference between nominal and real GDP. Nominal simply gives you a dollar amount. Okay? Real GDP tells you if you're making more stuff. Okay? How does it tell you if you're making more stuff? It holds the price level constant. Okay? Finally, there's some limitations of the GDP concept. Okay? This is, oops. You don't need it for this one, but it is slide 49. Slide 49. The limitations of the GDP concept are the three. One, you could be producing a lot of output, but it doesn't tell you if you're ruining the environment. Okay? So that's the first thing. Take China. China has enormous GDP growth, right? They're making more and more stuff every year. They grow at 7, 8, 9, 10, 12% every year. But if you've seen a picture of Beijing, and if you haven't, you should Google a picture of Beijing, there's pollution everywhere. It makes Los Angeles look clean. Okay? The second reason why GDP is not a perfect measurement of economic welfare is it doesn't tell us anything about distribution. Okay, right? Let's think about GDP. It was $10 million with the water bottle, right? Well, does one person have all $10 million and everyone else is starving? Or is everyone sharing it equally? We don't know from GDP. We're not sure. Okay? The third thing is GDP does not measure non-market activities. Okay? So such as, black market activities, crime, the underground economy, or tips even, right? Tips aren't always counted. But mafia stuff, things like that. That's not included in GDP. So you don't always get an accurate gauge of the size of economic activity. This is a common problem in developing countries. Okay? In developing countries, not a lot of economic activity is statistically reported. Most of it just happens through sharing, not a cash register. So therefore, what ends up happening is you don't have reliable statistics as to what GDP actually is. Okay? Okay, so that's lecture 1. Those are the topics that we were supposed to cover in this lecture. I think I went over about 15 minutes. I'm sorry about that. It probably won't happen again. We had to get through a lot today. But just to refresh your memory, right? Went over the syllabus. Then we did the history of economic thought tree. We saw there's a left side and a right side to macroeconomics, right? The left side sees capitalism as a socially harmonious system in which poverty, inequality, and unemployment are the individual's fault, whereas the right side sees that capitalism is actually not a harmonious system, it's a conflictual system, and in which poverty, inequality, and unemployment are naturally occur because of the system. Okay? Then I said that we're going to look at the neoclassicals, Keynes and the post-Keynesians, and the textbook Keynesians. The textbook Keynesians also go by the name neoclassical Keynesian synthesis or bastard Keynesians. Okay? After we looked at that, we looked at Heilbronner, and we saw there are 3 types of economic systems, right? Well, first, we saw that there's 2 definitions of economics, right? There's the allocation of scarce resources amongst competing ends, and the social provisioning process, which deals with the economic problem, right? What to produce, who's going to produce it, who's going to get it. And then there's 3 types of economic systems. There's a market, which is capitalism is a type of a market economy with an advanced financial system. There's a command economy, and there's a traditional economy. Okay? Then we looked at some of the preconditions necessary for a market economy to exist, for capitalism to work. And then we looked at the macroeconomic approach. Okay? We saw that macroeconomics is all about output, employment, and prices. Those are the 3 things we're going to be looking at in this course. Then we looked at how you measure output, right? GDP, how economists measure that. This next sentence, the next 30 seconds, is probably going to be very important for us going forward. Okay? Now that we've set up the macroeconomic approach, now that I've told you macroeconomics looks at growth output, employment, and prices, what we're going to be doing now for the next 3-4 classes, right? The next lecture we're going to do supply and demand. But after that, we're going to look at the neoclassicals, the Keynes, and the textbook Keynesians. Okay? When we do that, all three of those schools agree that output, employment, and prices are the most essential things to look at for macroeconomics. Where they disagree is what determines the level of employment. For example, Keynes believes that the level of employment is determined by the total level of spending in the economy. Keynes said that the more cash registers go off, the more businesses will hire people. Okay? The neoclassicals argue that the level of employment is determined in the labor market. Okay? So despite the fact that these two groups both feel employment is a very important issue in macroeconomics, they disagree on what determines that variable. Okay? So that's what we're going to be looking at for the next 3-4 classes. We're going to be looking at these different schools of economic thought and what determines each of those 3 variables. Okay? And I've even created a little spreadsheet for you that's posted on Blackboard. Forget the name of it, but it's some determination of macroeconomic variables by school. Okay? And it lists employment, growth, price level, and what determines the price level, what determines output, what determines employment. Okay? So as we start going in the next couple of sessions, maybe you want to just keep that by you and for quick reference throughout the lectures, okay? I'm going to shut off the camera now and feel free to go on to lecture 2 or take a break until next week.